Welcome, guys, to the World XP Podcast. Samir, welcome back. I think this is the most I've seen you in a while, so no complaints from me on that end. And then John,
Happy to be here.
John, first time, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we got a lot of subject material to cover. It's very pertinent to the current situation, and so I want to spend as much time deep in the weeds as possible. So you want to knock out? Let's do a quick intro for the both of you, and then we can just kind of hop right into it. John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jon Turek. I run JST Advisors, which is a global macro hedge fund advisory business. I publish a once a week research note with what I hope to be asymmetric macro trade ideas. I work with some of the biggest hedge funds, pension funds, real money types. And yeah, that's the gist.
Sounds good. Samir?
Okay, very quickly, I am Samir Varma. I am a physicist by training. I'm a hedge fund manager by vocation. And if you look over my shoulder, there is the cover of my book, The Science of Free Will. That's how I met Eric. And this particular podcast is very much up my particular alley, just like John, because I need to deal with the financial markets just like John does. My hedge fund is a small boutique hedge fund, and so the P&L is something that definitely affects me.
Sounds good. So I think, can we maybe start the conversation by framing a little bit, both from a macroeconomics perspective, like what does that actually mean for people listening? And then secondarily, kind of what the moves that have happened in the last, I don't know, two, 3 weeks. So we can just set the stage for the discussion. Either one of you, John, if you want to take kind of the macro piece, and then Samir, if you want to take the moves that have taken place by both our government and then governments around the world. So John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, in terms of kind of putting it, what's going on now, I think that we have an administration in the US that has a lot of things in mind. And we seem to, one is to reorder the global trading system. And, I think that the reciprocal side of that, which was either factored in or not factored in as much, is that the capital account is just the reciprocal of the trade balance. And as money leaves the US in terms of purchasing goods, money comes in by the purchase of financial assets. And what I think we're dealing with now is that, one, we have the uncertainty of what all this means in terms of a practical business and investment sense. Very hard for businesses to operate when they don't know the rules. And then I think the second thing is it's very hard for global capital to operate when the same thing is true. And, as I said, kind of just in that previous point, is that these two things are highly linked. So, I think that I think sets the stage for, what's going on now, and we can get into sort of the minutia. But, I think that something that at least I feel has sort of been under discussed is that, once you say the global trading system that we've kind of embraced since not only China's ascension to WTO, but really since, the Reagan and Thatcher days of neoliberalism, global capital also has to reorder. And I think that happens a bit more quickly, as we've seen in financial markets.
Fair enough. Samir, so what are some of the moves that, at least the ones that have taken everyone by surprise and prompted your text of this is insanity, and I don't use that word lightly. So what's been going on recently?
So I want to amplify something that John just said, because it's an incredibly important point. And if you're not sort of steeped in it up to the eyeballs like we are, a lot of people miss that point. So I really want to amplify this. What John said is that the capital account is the flip side of the trade deficit. And this is an arithmetic identity. It is the statement that 2 equals 2 or 4 equals 4. Now, what does that mean? It's really important that your audience understand this. Imagine that we buy an apple from Venezuela. Let's say we paid $1 for the apple. Now, Venezuela has $1 and we have an apple. Now, what can Venezuela do with that dollar? There's only 2 things it can do with it. I can give it to somebody else, but then that other person has to do the same thing. So it doesn't matter. That dollar has to come back into the country in one of two ways. It can either buy something from us, it can buy a soybean, say, or it can be invested in the United States. Those are the only two choices. If it comes back and let's say we buy soybeans, then we'll say, oh gosh, look, trade with Venezuela is balanced. But if Venezuela decides, in fact, to invest that dollar either in American debt or in a factory or something else, we say, oh gosh, look, there's a trade deficit. A dollar went out. Yes. And then Venezuela took that dollar and invested it back into the country. So in fact, you cannot, this is what the administration doesn't understand. This is where the insanity comes in. You cannot ask for foreigners to invest in your country if you do not run a trade deficit. It is an arithmetic impossibility. They need the dollars with which to invest. They can only get those dollars if you buy something from them. And this point is constantly lost, and it drives me absolutely insane. So that's point number one. Point number two is that then when you see the pronouncements coming out of the White House, anyone with, any experience at all in the financial market looks at it and says, this is nonsense. It's not like it's a difference of opinion. It's just nonsense. And because it's nonsense, financial markets go crazy because they don't know what to do. And you can see the result of that. John will back me up on this. You can see the result of that in the fact that normally when you put in tariffs, I won't go through the economics, but normally when you put in tariffs, your currency strengthens for various technical reasons. We don't have to worry about it. But in fact, what's been happening is the currency has been weakening. Normally, when there's a global panic, people buy US treasuries, which makes the yields go down. Right now, people are worried about the United States, so yields are going up. Both of these are telling you that the government has lost the world has lost confidence in the United States, and that's just terrible. Because this is a trading order we built for our own purposes to make us the richest and most successful country, essentially in the history of mankind. And now we seem to be willing to blow it up, and it's nuts. And that's what the financial markets are reacting to.
Okay, so the first thing on the trade deficit point, I think even without the piece of like there's only two options for that dollar, a trade deficit, like, to me it seems is not even inherently a bad thing. Like if I go to the store, the grocery store, I'm running a trade deficit with the store, but I still have my food, so like it's fine. Um, the other point, so a lot of the questions that I have, so like are coming from I pay enough attention to understand what all the words that you just said mean, but then not what the impact is. So a lot of the questions that I have personally are kind of like they're very much like why questions. So like the first one that I have, so you mentioned tariffs. So like if people say, okay, if a tariff is putting a tax on trade, which I think trade probably is a good thing generally because the voluntary parties, you would expect that you would get something out of it, and I would expect that I would get something out of it. So why would we want to put a tax, or to me, a tax is a disincentive, like a disincentive to trade. But then on the flip side, then why do other countries have them on us? But then if they're good, why don't we have like 500% tariffs on everybody? So like, what's the balance of that, and like, how does that work? Because I think lots of people, there's some people that are like, okay, tariffs are insane, and the other people are like, no, this means that manufacturing will come back to the United States, and neither of those seems to be the full picture. So like, either of you can take that, but like, as somebody who like knows what the word tariff means, but doesn't understand what the impact is, like really truly, where like, how should people be thinking about this situation? Because people are saying, oh, they're bad, but then we have tariffs imposed on us. But if they're good, why don't we just have it on everybody in the first place, anyways?
John, do you want to shoot first? It's an easy
Yeah,
target.
yeah. So it's an interesting question. And I think that, there's two parts to it because one is the administration clearly feels that tariffs solve more problems than just trade, right? We've seen that they've talked about some sort of external revenue service, which is basically that tariffs are a way to pay down national debt. We've seen that tariffs are negotiating leverage from anything from trade deficits to returning people to different countries. We saw that with the Colombia episode. So, I think that there's part of it kind of taking out the strictly macroeconomic sense is that the administration feels that tariffs are a tool, you know, to solve lots of different things. Now, principally, I think the trade deficit is what they, you know, some of the more, I would say the intellectual side of the administration uses it as, but the president clearly feels comfortable that the tariffs are a hammer and for any nail. Um, so that I think is one point of it. The second point I think is that, you know, the United States made a, could say, implicit or explicit decision that, you know, the manufacturing cheap goods was almost a national interest. And I think a lot of this came from, the inflation scarring of the 1970s when we had a whole, economic restructuring in the 1980s. And, I think that the trade-off between as an aggregate, and we can debate, obviously, everyone will have a different opinion of, what worked and what didn't. But, the trade-off of, importing cheap stuff and basically exporting some blue collar labor, that was seemingly one that was willingly made. Now, there were lots of benefits to this. Obviously, we've had massive productivity enhancements since global trade really took off in the 80s and 90s. But there also have been, there have been costs. I wouldn't say that it was a free lunch. And I think that, something that the administration in all three of the presidential elections that he's running has tapped into is that there is this sort of yearning or nostalgia for a different era in which like blue collar jobs were a more meaningful part of the workforce. And, to a large part, they have gone away. I mean, manufacturing as a percentage of the US economy has shrunk massively since the 1980s. So, I do think that there is that element of maybe the, what could be, not as a nefarious take on this is that global trade is good. Free trade went too far and it wasn't necessarily as free as it was pitched. I think that would kind of be what, a less, harsh take on the administration's actions, both in Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is trying to accomplish. And then I think, on your point of like, well, tariffs, if they're good, why not max them out? I think that there's a little bit, there is, again, not to be the defender of the policy, but just to try and explain it. I do think that there is a line that they're trying to toe. I mean, if you talk to even reasonable, more traditionally conservative members of, the community me and Samir are in, there were plenty of advocates for 10% across the board tariff. And the idea is that is enough of a, mechanism to sort of rebalance trade, rebalance global investment, but also not, completely throw out the architecture, right? Like, in Trump 1.0, we had tariffs on China that, at the time, it hasn't stuck since, and there's all sorts of reasons for why, did technically shrink the trade deficits between the United States and China, but also didn't rupture the trade relationship, right? Right where we are now is that, the US has basically told the world factory to turn off. Because nothing really works if your tariff is 145 or 245 or whatever crazy number you put on. So I do think that there is this line where you sort of encourage businesses to make different decisions, but you don't cause a recession. So I think that's kind of the answer to the why not do 500% if it's a good policy. I think that it's almost forward guidance, right? You're trying to get companies to be like, listen, going forward, we'll pay this cost now because we have to, but we really don't want to pay it going forward. So let's invest in a factory in the United States that going forward we don't have to pay it. But that also this is not at a level now that's destabilizing enough to the business that we're no longer profitable. Which for a lot of companies that import Chinese goods right now, this of course is not a durable paradigm.
Yeah. Samir, before you jump in, I want to add one thing. Like, what makes tariffs a good leveraging tool? Because we've heard, or I've heard, at least in my various readings of things. It's like, oh, well, it'll just make things more expensive for the US consumer. It's like, okay, well, if that's true, then why do other companies or why do other countries even care that we're putting tariffs on them if the US consumer is just going to eat the cost? So like where does the leverage actually come from? Like he threatened Canada with tariffs and then he said if you don't put troops on your border to protect the border, I'm going to put tariffs on you and then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, our bad. We'll put some troops there." But like what actually makes that a viable threat or a negotiating tool to you, Samir?
Okay. So what makes it a viable threat is that by and large, because the United States is such a large economy, we actually don't, relative to the size of our economy, import all that much. But what we do import is pretty darn important because most of it we can't make ourselves, and almost all of it we wouldn't want to make ourselves, with some exceptions. So that the leverage it gives us is that if I fire one bullet at myself, it's the equivalent of firing 4 bullets at you. So I might be hurting myself, but I'm going to hurt you a lot more. That's the leverage we've got. The question is, what is the purpose of this leverage? You see, there's a huge confusion, if to put it politely, in the administration with regard to tariffs. So imagine that, say, Canada puts a tariff on US goods. So the first people that are hurt by that are Canadians, exactly as you just said. That's the substantial hurt that's going to be the case because the Canadians are the people that are going to be paying those tariffs. The second hurt, which is secondary, and in physics terms, the second order effect, is that it means that the market for US manufacturers just shrank a little bit. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to stop a first order effect with a second order effect, which is also not very smart. Because now suppose that you go to a completely zero tariff situation between two countries. The country that had the lowest tariffs, i.e. the United States, benefits the least. So in fact, what you're trying to do when you're telling the European Union, for example, you have these tariffs, which by the way aren't that high, they're like an average of 3%, but anyway, put that aside. You have these tariffs on our goods, you bad people, you need to lower them, fine. But at the end of the day, the amount of gain to you is going to be substantially dwarfed by whatever gain is gained by the EU. So the net result of our tariff policy is a gain to the other side because our tariffs are so small to begin with, or were so small to begin with. Now, then the administration makes an even weirder argument, which is, well, it's necessary for national security. That's true. But if you're worried about certain components and other things for national security, you need to subsidize those directly. You need to say, we need to make X, Y, Z, whatever it is, domestically in the United States in case we ever go to war or have other problems. So we need to reshore those factories. You do that with a subsidy, which is on budget and transparent. Not through the sort of crony capitalist nonsense that we're doing now with random tariffs that people, randomly pull out of ChatGPT, it seems sometimes. And put tariffs on penguins in uninhabited islands. It's just bizarre. And then at the same time, as I said earlier, they want to bring investment into the country. But guys, it's not possible. It's an arithmetic identity. You cannot bring investment into the country and shrink the trade deficit. It can't be done. It's literally impossible. That's the issue.
Mm-hmm. So let's so the next kind of segue into questions kind of goes off the subsidy piece, which is like if the point of the European ones in particular is that they pay their fair share for defense or NATO or whatever it happens to be, why instead of imposing a tariff, why would we not just withhold the subsidies or the aid that we're giving? Wouldn't that do the same? Like, I don't understand. I guess this is what I'm getting at, right? It seems like the American people have voted in some way, shape, or form for a change to the status quo, and to change the status quo of the global trade economy. Like things are going to get super weird for a little while. And like it seems like we're in the first part of that. So in terms of like the subsidies for other countries or like the foreign aid like things like that, why would we not just stop giving the foreign aid instead of imposing a tariff like you know what I
Well,
like
honestly, because it's not that big.
The foreign aid is
Our
not that
foreign
big,
aid is
or
pretty tiny. Yeah, it's
okay.
not much. That's the first issue. And the second issue is it's completely true that the Europeans have been freeloading on NATO. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
But you fix that, it seems to me, politically. I'm going to leave this to John in a second. You fix that, it would seem to me, by doing something sane.
Yeah. Well, definitely not going to argue on that. I think that, on the using it for other things, not just to, rectify trade deficits for just for the sake of having, a smaller one. I think that something, and whether this is right or wrong, is that something that could have been, like, in terms of the execution, that could have been a little bit more neat, is you could use tariffs as basically political leverage and also not, ground global business to a halt. Like, I don't know that, I'm not convinced. I mean, I may be wrong. I'm obviously, not a like pro tariff disposition, but I think if the administration wanted to achieve things such as European rearmament, so that there's no European freeloading on our security umbrella, or if it wanted to break Asian mercantilism, which is just, their reliance on exports as a, driver of economic growth, which really is, basically based on the US consumer. If they wanted those things to change, which we could argue, but I think that's not an unreasonable policy decision. And if they wanted to use tariffs as part of the calculus to achieve those policy outcomes, they could have done it without sort of this, you know, math that doesn't really make sense, and done it in this massively destabilizing way, which I think ironically has weakened their negotiating leverage, right? Because if they went to Europe and was like, listen, if you don't meet your NATO requirements over the next 3 years, we're going to do a 10% across the board tariff. I think that would have that kicks in 6 months and then kicks in more in 9 months, whatever. The sequencing doesn't even necessarily matter. That would have sent a pretty big message to Brussels. And it also wouldn't have, crashed US corporate sentiment, US household sentiment, in the sense of we don't know how to proceed. If that headline came across, it's possible that, the US equity market wouldn't have acted well that day. I don't think it would have cared over the next 6 months. And I do think that, through measures in terms of foreign policy, they could have given the message that, listen, we're not accepting European external account surpluses that are so big when you don't take care of your own security. I think like a term I kind of used early on in this proceeding, even though it feels like 2 years ago, but it was only 6 weeks ago. I kind of coined the term the Trump paradox. And the idea was that Trump is so existentially negative to a lot of these places that he could paradoxically be positive by catalyzing structural reforms that were sorely needed in a lot of these jurisdictions, right? Like German fiscal which they announced in spades after the German election at the end of February in response to Trump. This was before April 2nd, but sort of where the cards were at least being drawn initially. They announced a fiscal package that looks like it's going to be in the ballpark of 800 billion euros to 1 trillion euros over the next 10 years. I mean, that's very significant. And if you kind of compare that, well, you say, okay, there's going to be tariffs on German exports to the United States. That's 3% of GDP, when German fiscal policy, it looks like it's going to be between 10 and 15% of GDP. So this is all this to say is that there are merits to kind of getting different actions even out of what we would consider partners economically and both foreign policy. But there is clearly a fine line between massively destabilizing, which weakens your position also, to, what could have been a German fiscal package along with a 10% tariff, if that was sort of the net trade for the global economy, I think we might have celebrated that. We being
Yeah.
financial markets.
Yeah. And let me add something to that. Notice something interesting about what Jon said. By the way, I agree with everything he just said. Notice something interesting about what Jon just said. The benefit of that nonsense is flowing to the German consumer. What are we, the Americans, getting out of it? This is the point. This is why this is so insane. And the way Jon is suggesting it, it might actually have worked. And in that case, there'd be some bilateral benefit to both sides, which is to say the US puts some pressure on Germany to get its house in order. And because Germany gets its house in order, the US has some benefit. And the Germans have some political cover to, make the changes that they need to make, because they say, oh, look, the big bad Americans are making us do this, and so on. And then the second thing is that then you could have taken a united front with the Europeans, for example, and possibly other countries as well. India comes to mind, and basically said to China, look, you guys are not behaving by proper rules in the WTO. You have a lot of state-sponsored and state-subsidized companies. We don't like this. And there are other things about the way you guys are behaving that we don't like. And we're coming here to you with a united front. This is a pretty big hammer when there's the rest of the world coming at you. You guys need to behave. There would have been some chance that have done something. I don't know. But it would have at least had some shot at making some change in behavior. But what's happening now is essentially you're catalyzing, Jon's absolutely right, you're catalyzing a lot of changes in other countries, which is to their benefit, but it's not going to do anything for us.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm taking in information, right? I don't live in these worlds the same way that you guys do. I listen to Jamie Dimon talk about the situation, and then I also listened to a few interviews with the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who seems, I'm not super familiar with his background, but the way that he talks about the situation and the plan, it also makes sense to me in terms of, like, okay, if we're gonna bring in tariff revenue and then we're gonna cut government spending, then the domestic economy will do better, or the dollar will do better. So I don't like, I guess, at least in my head, what he said doesn't even disagree with like what you guys are saying either. And so I'm not really sure exactly what the question I'm asking is, but it seems like there's the potential for great positive, while saying like, yeah, this is kind of nuts, but then sometimes it works out. Like I don't really know, because one, well, I guess I could just leave it there if that's enough for you guys to go on.
So let me say one thing, and then I'll leave it to Jon. This is not either first best, second best, or even third best way of doing what Scott Bessent is talking about.
Sure.
If he really wants to do what he's talking about, then the right way to do it, and most economists will back me up on this, left or right wing, it doesn't even matter, is to switch to a consumption-based taxation system, not tariffs. So what you do is you impose it, you get rid of other taxes, corporate taxes, inheritance taxes, income taxes, and so on and so forth, and you impose a consumption tax.
Yes, I have that in my question, that you would get rid of income tax and other, yeah.
Right. That is how you do what he's talking about, not with these crazy tariff impositions, because tariff impositions aren't really doing anything for you. They're a very inefficient way of collecting revenue to begin with. And this weird nostalgia for what happened in the late 1890s to the early 1910s is bizarre, because every economist that studied that period basically tells you that the tariffs were actually harmful and not a good thing for the US economy.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, to add to that, in that period, I think trade in terms of global goods was around 2 or 3% of global GDP, when today it's 12. So not exactly an apples for apples comparison. Yeah, no, I think that, I think with Bessent and others in the administration sort of, have in mind is they have a big structural vision, but they also have a, sort of like near-term cyclical vision. And the problem is that those two things can clash, and they often do. And the problem I have with the, tariffs to pay down the national debt, things of that nature, or bring in money to lower the deficit, is that if as we're seeing it's as economically harmful as it appears to be, you are not, you're actually hurting the situation, because the last thing a country that has a debt problem can afford is a recession. And a real way to get the budget deficit to go up, even as you take in, external revenue, is for GDP to go down, because the budget deficit, the ratio we care about is the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. So that I think is a concern. I mean, I think another concern in all this is, kind of coming back to Samir's point as, confidence in US assets and how significant those sort of dynamics are. I mean, we saw last week a material sell-off in US Treasuries on the back of what appeared to be a confidence issue. And 50 basis points in 10-year US Treasuries basically unwound any of the $150 billion in Doge savings in 2 days. So, I think that there is, so I'm like, there is plenty of sympathy to be had for an administration that says the system doesn't work for their voter, right? And that, I think, is sort of the sentiment that sort of is underpinning a lot of these more radical changes. And we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but clearly a meaningful amount of Americans feel that. So I don't want to just dismiss it. But the execution when you're doing this stuff is imperative, because one, as Samir said, the first order effects are obvious, but I think something that this administration has missed is the second order impacts are really where I think a lot of the constraints are coming in. And an example of this I hear is Bessent and Stephen Moran, who's the chairman of who's one of Trump's economic advisors. The talking point they've pitched on tariffs is that the surplus country pays the tariff. And there is an economics backing to that statement, but I professionally try to live, as I'm not a trained economist, is some things that are true maybe in theory but are not true in practice. And I think that kind of we're in that second order impact of, well, who pays? As Samir said, it's obviously just a tax hike, as you said, Eric, on the US consumer. And I think another element of it is that the United States has benefited to a large degree from basically being the lubricant of the global trading system by being a massive recipient of global capital. And I would say, not say this fact, the US capital account surplus, capital coming in versus capital going out, is actually become outsized to the strict trade deficit over the last few years. And that's why you've lived in a world where in traditional economics, a 6 to 7% budget deficit, which the United States currently runs, and a 3 to 4% trade surplus, which the United States currently runs, could not coexist with a rising currency. And we've had that for the last 3 years now, basically. But the reason that has been able to happen is that the marginal global dollar has flowed in to plug that gap. And now, for confidence reasons, but also just the arithmetic of, if you want to shrink the trade deficit, then the capital account surplus goes down as well. That is not happening. And I think that has really large ramifications on some of the bigger picture structural things the administration wants to get done.
Yeah, so let me add to that, because that's an incredibly important point that Jon just made. So here's the thing. You could argue, and many have, and it's a perfectly intellectually respectable argument, that the US consumer consumes too much and the US as a whole doesn't invest enough. The issue there is that if you look at our budget, 40 to 50%, depending on how you count, is eaten up by entitlements, automatic spending. Our deficit is largely driven by the fact that our politicians don't seem to care about the fact that they are deficit spending and don't seem to want to get the budget house in order. Because we are the world's sort of, reserve currency and we have seigniorage rights, foreigners have been until recently willing to deal with the fact that we have a 6 or 7% budget deficit, which cannot last for any significant length of time, but it has with the United States. They are now in the process of blowing that up, but in no way, if you look at what they're proposing to Congress, worrying about the budget deficit. That seems to have completely gone out of the window. So you've got a situation now where our interest costs have risen because of this very silly policy. That's going to massively increase, as John just said, the amount of cost that the debt is going to be to us, our interest costs. We've done absolutely nothing to put our entitlements or any other spending in order. And we're hurting our own internal economy with these indiscriminate tariffs, because a lot of the stuff that comes into the country is not finished goods. It's raw materials, for example, that we transform into other things. Those are being tariffed too. So the whole thing actually, just as a package, makes no sense. Now, it's perfectly true that a lot of Trump voters were hurt by the accession of China to the WTO. And it's absolutely true that a significant portion of the US industrial base, the cheap industrial manufacturing base, disappeared. But there are two things. One, that's no different than technological change. We don't have typists anymore, right? More or less everybody types for themselves. We don't have 90% of Americans used to work in agriculture. It's down below 1% now, I believe. These changes happen in the economy all the time. The second thing is that successful economies, like, for example, Scandinavia, even though they have high taxes, have flexible labor markets, but at the same time, they help their labor when they lose their job. And the real problem we have in the United States is the fact that when people lose their job, we do not have good unemployment assistance. We don't have good retraining assistance, and so on. That's the actual issue. And what we should be focusing on is the actual issue as opposed to focusing on the red herring.
Yeah. So the labor force, the last point that you mentioned, I think is interesting, the unemployment piece, because we subsidize you if you're unemployed, and then if you go find work, then we tax you. And it's like that incentive structure doesn't seem great. So to go back to your earlier point about getting rid of the income tax, then that would be if they were to do it the way that Besson seems to be proposing and getting rid of all these taxes, that would then solve that problem of taxing labor, which I think is a good thing generally speaking, instead of subsidizing not working in terms of like the incentive structure for the population. But the other thing, like, so this is the thing that I don't understand, well, generally speaking, is that you mentioned having this budget deficit is not sustainable. I think everyone agrees with that. The debt's too high. Like what? Okay, if you guys could wave a magic wand then and be like, I would take these 5 steps to fix it. And the other reason I say that is because you talked about entitlements and other the automatic spending of the government. To touch some of those programs is political suicide. So like if you run around saying, okay, yeah, I'm gonna cut Medicare and Social Security and do all these other things, then all of a sudden you're not going to get elected. And so like in my head, it's like, okay, well, if I can't do that, then like how else am I gonna increase revenue? And I'm not saying that what they're doing is the right way, but there's a lot of things that go into play there where you've got the kind of current beneficiaries of like the way things are going now who are going to be very upset if you try and shake that up. And then so you've got to deal with that, and then you've got to deal with the political piece of it, and then you've got to deal with the societal piece of it, and then also like as we've mentioned, or as Trump said in one of his in the State of the Union, where he's like, "I can't do anything to make you guys happy," and then people pointed to like that kid that he said was going to be in the Secret Service, and nobody stood up for it. Like, but there's all these things to deal with. So I don't. This is where I get to the point of like where you guys are saying like, yes, I wouldn't do it this way, and I'm like tracking. But then what's there to like as I tick off the list of things like in my head that maybe I would try to change. Like in an ideal world, you could go through the US government budget line item by line item and just slash, which Doge seems to be trying to do. But then every line item that you slash, you'll end up with pushback from either the federal employees that will lose their jobs if you slash that, or some park somewhere that is getting federal funding or whatever the case may be. So like the situation is extremely complex, and like if you could wave, like I don't know, I guess like what would you guys be doing? And because it seems like
So
they're okay. Go ahead. I'm giving
I
you a
can
lot.
tell you what
Yeah,
I would do,
yeah,
and then I'll leave it to John to tell you what he would do. But I can tell you exactly what I would do. The first thing is that I would worry about increasing the growth rate of the economy. A lot of the problems that occur from a fiscal point of view are when your growth rates start to fall. When the pie is not growing fast enough, it becomes very difficult to finance your priorities. That's the first issue.
So
And
how do you do that?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So post-financial crisis, that's been the first problem. The second point is that to fix your growth rate, you have to take a lot of cumulative, unsexy steps. And each one of them by itself will add a tenth of a point or 2/10 of a point to GDP. None of them are going to make a huge difference, but collectively they make a massive difference. So, number one, you need to worry about permitting reform. And unfortunately, that's a state level issue. Construction in the United States is tied up for years and 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 years by lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, where basically nobody ever wants to let anybody construct anything. So we have the highest construction costs in the world and some of the most difficulty constructing anything. That's the first thing that needs to be fixed. And a significant portion of the economy, by the way, is construction and construction driven, and that's inefficient as all hell. That's number one. Number two is you need to have a proper tax reform, an intelligent one, not this jumping up and down with, I'm going to have a 36% tax rate. Oh no, I'm going to have a 39% tax rate and the rich should pay their fair share, or whatever other nonsense is the slogan of the week. You can't do that. You have to have root and branch tax reform. And that tax reform means switching to some sort of a consumption tax, not an income tax, a consumption tax. You can do it in many different ways. One of the simplest ways, for example, is to not tax money that's put into an investment account until it's taken out of the investment account. That's just one example. But there's a lot of ways of switching to consumption as opposed to taxing income. That's the second thing I would do, which is important. The third thing I would do is not go around slashing agencies, because that's just silly. What I would do instead is go to the agencies and empower them, because one of the reasons the agencies are incredibly bureaucratic is because we have imposed upon them all sorts of insane procedures and policies and regulations and so on that they need to follow. The fourth part of that is that government officials don't have very much discretion to do anything anymore. So some parts of government, they do have some discretion. For example, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Products Agency, I believe. Most of the people that fund programs there have discretion to fund essentially whatever they want. And nobody oversees them, and nobody complains that they failed, and nobody says this and nobody says that. And DARPA has been very successful. We need to give people agency to do things and allow them to do stuff. Fifth, we need to move away from prescriptive rules to descriptive rules. That is to say, you actually have to trust your officials to do the right thing. So you have to tell them, look, this is what we want to do. And this is the goal. And we want you to get there in the most efficient possible way. We don't do that. We instead impose rule after regulation after regulation in a detailed way to do it, and after which nobody understands anything. And lastly, we need to get Congress to actually take back its legislative power. What Congress keeps doing, because everybody's is just focused on getting reelected, is giving its power away. So nobody can ever blame them for doing anything. So they're constantly delegating power. So for example, this crazy tariff stuff that's going on, this could be reversed in 2 shakes of a duck's tail, as they say, if Congress just took back the tariff power, which, by the way, is Congress's to begin with. And it's not even obvious to me that they can delegate it away. That will be for the Supreme Court to deal with. So it's non-sexy stuff. None of it is sexy. None of it looks fantastic. None of it makes anybody jump up and down and say, oh my God, what a brilliant idea. It's just, what they say about football. It's blocking and tackling. That's really all there is to it, in my opinion.
I don't know. Getting rid of the income tax and getting rid of a lot of regulation seems pretty fun to me. So, John, do you have anything to add to that, or how would you?
Yeah,
how would you do
listen,
it?
it definitely above my pay grade. Apparently, you have to be worth $270 billion to do this stuff. I think though, one point I think is key is that, this is not, given the state of the budget finances as they are, and given that we, live in a democracy where we elect officials every 2 years, basically, there's no way you can cut your way out of this, and probably nor should you. So growth does have to be a focus, and I think, and probably an discussed, under talked about thing of the last 2 or 3 years, really since 2022 or in 2021, is that the debt to GDP ratio in the US, like it blew out from COVID, but has actually been quite stagnant to slightly falling since because we've produced a lot of nominal growth over the last 3 years. Um, and so I think that, we're given where we are, growth has to be the focus of the way out. Now, how you achieve that growth, the ideas presented seem very sensible to me. I don't have like, the exact policy description, but I think that um, from an orientation perspective, that clearly has to be something that's like very focused on. And on the spending side, as we said, seemingly half of the budget is a no touch. Um, so it doesn't leave you, a ton to work with. But I think that we kind of have to, and what I think Doge misses a little bit forest for the trees is that, you know, especially the way government accounting works, it makes more sense for things to be phased in and phased out as opposed to, you know, immediately put together and immediately disbanded. Like given the way government accounting works, is it make more sense to be like, okay, over this program, over the next, you know, 5 to 10 years, we have a destination of outlay that we want to get to, and we're going to do this instead of going to a department and saying you no longer exist, which will have second order impacts that we may not be comfortable with. We don't know; it's too soon to say. But I think that that is another element, right? It's not the United States doesn't have a traditional private sector creditor issue of you need that money tomorrow or they're gonna come knocking on the door. Like it just we need to be credible as planners more than we need to be have the dollar and cents tomorrow to pay. Which is a great privilege that they've been afforded, but is the reality. So I kind of think about it more. You know, you think about it more in the way Chinese run policy, obviously a whole different system, but I think that the United States could actually have more practical spending cuts if they were phased out as opposed to, you know, arbitrarily or non-arbitrarily, but like abruptly cut and then reimposed by the Supreme Court and then taken back and not. And it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it's a recipe for chaos for sure, which I know the
Yeah.
markets don't like. But then one of my maybe shorter questions is like, how long does it take for a policy announcement like the one you mentioned from Doge or like the tariff announcement to actually take effect in the stock market? One of the things that Besant said in the interview that I watched was that that big dip in the stock market was also due in part to the Chinese announcement of DeepSeek, where the tech stocks took a hit. And I was like, I don't know. I have no way of knowing if that's okay. You're shaking your head. Well, we can, all right, we can move on.
Doesn't agree.
Do you have more
Sorry,
to
he may
add
be
or
a
just no?
billionaire, but he has a book to talk, and the book that he wants to talk is his president's opinion. And I would be stunned if Scott Bessent, the fund manager, would say the same thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Well, then the rest of the question though, how long does it take for an announcement like that to actually impact? Can we see same day impact to things like that, or like does it take a little bit of
Depends
time?
depends what you mean by impact.
Okay, so like, well, like the tariff announcement came out on what the Friday, I think, and then the Monday, I think it was like what the first or the second. All of a
Yep.
sudden, the stock markets were down by some, I'll say relatively significant percentage. Is that
Yep.
can it move that quickly, or does it take more time, or does it
Yes.
depend on what the announcement is?
No, it depends on what the announcement is. The market is going to try to price it immediately, which it did. But that's merely its first reaction. Then there'll be more rethinking about the reaction, and it's going to adjust as more information comes in as well. And also, people can't adjust their positions instantaneously. So generally speaking, the first reaction tends to be an underreaction, but you do get a counter reaction to the first reaction, and then you tend to fall further. That's just typically how markets tend to work. But yeah, initially they're going to try to price it more or less immediately, as much as they can.
Mm. The other thing that we've talked about is the confidence in the U.S. as like a institution, I guess, in terms of financially. And one of the things that um, I heard this as well, and I don't know how true this is, but I've heard it multiple places where like if the government is can fund itself by like selling treasury bonds and then the Fed can buy them by printing money, then like as the economy is fueled on debt, I think generally speaking, at least in the US, it seems like kind of a house of cards. And so like it looks to me like there's a big bubble that's waiting to burst, regardless of what happens. And so I don't really know how to like think about that in terms of okay, well, the administration is making economic moves, but at the same time, it's like, well, if one person can't pay back the circular like debt, and then we end up in a 2008, maybe not for housing, but for something else. Um, I don't what is your take on the situation, either of you? Am I thinking about it completely wrong? Am I just off base, or is there some truth to it? Or like, how should people be concerned with, I'll say, well, I guess recession, but with the definition of like two negative quarters in a row, but like long-term economic downturn, or like how are you guys thinking about the situation at the moment? John, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. So there's always, there's always something to pick at in terms of no economy is ever going to be in a perfect state of bliss equilibrium. And I would say that the United States fiscal situation is was a concern going into Liberation Day. It's a concern coming out of Liberation Day. I don't think that necessarily a house of cards. I don't think the idea of the Fed buys it, the Treasury sells it, and the Fed buys it. That's just debt monetization. We've seen that play out in other countries, and it's Argentina most namely, and they went bankrupt more than once. Um, the Fed does not do that. We've had periods where the Fed has bought government securities in an effort to either stimulate the economy or calm financial markets in times of turmoil. But they're not principally um, the ones who fund the budget deficit. They own a large percentage of treasuries, but they're by no means the biggest holder of treasuries out of the composition.
Even so, if they're
And
not the biggest, it feels kind of like cheating. It's like, okay, well, we need to like correct this thing, so we'll just make up some stuff and then make like print some money and then but like it doesn't feel stable, I guess.
Right. No, I know, and I hear that, and you can easily make the argument that, especially in the COVID rendition of this, that the Fed maybe overdid it. Like people have made that argument, and given the inflationary impulse we saw ex post, I think that's a totally reasonable take. I think where I sort of have a problem, where I don't agree with your point is that I don't think that that is it feels like cheating because it doesn't work for us, but governments don't operate like households and businesses, right? They are the way that this works is the United States is the dollar is backed by credibility. It's backed by a strong military, it's backed by rule of law, it's backed by a strong economy. Like that, those are the underpinnings of we don't have it's not backed by gold anymore, it's not backed by a physical asset. So that is the system, and as we've seen since 1913 when the Fed was instituted as a mechanism to prevent financial crises, right? That was how they came into be. They certainly don't have a perfect record, um,
That's
but
for sure.
they certainly don't have a perfect record, but they have acted as, I would say, a meaningful shock absorber where financial market episodes now have, I would say, a neutering in terms of, not to say that everything is now fixed, but they're really able to make the shock a little bit smaller in terms of the real economy. Now, again, no perfect episode. We have 2008 financial crisis. Um, we have the savings and loans crisis in the early 90s. There's plenty of episodes of Fed errors leading to bad economic outcomes. But I think on balance, the institution has served the American public well. Um, and I think that kind of coming back to the original question of were things going bad before um, tariff policy, and I think the we were generally in a period of a economics, not, I wouldn't say slowed down, but we were, the economy was gradually slowing. I think that some of that was by design in an effort to, kind of get inflation back to target. We saw, periods of last year where we had, small moves higher in the unemployment rate. We've seen the hiring rate in the economy come down to levels not really seen since the early 2010s. And you can kind of feel the labor market is a little bit less dynamic than it was over the last 3 or 4 years. But I don't think that we were, on a beeline or had like a date with destiny with a really bad economic outcome because, not all of the backdrop things were perfect. I do think that if we enter, excuse me, a meaningful economic contraction, based off of, the new administration's policies, I think it would be more of an own goal than some sort of, this was going to happen either way. Not to say that I think that this is automatically going to lead to some sort of nasty, prolonged recession. I don't know. I mean, I don't think any of us know. But I don't think that the sort of scary economic outcomes that we're now debating were, going to happen anyway. And
How
of course,
well?
anything could happen, but I don't think that was the course we were on.
But why
Yeah,
not?
so let me add
If
something to that, Eric,
can I
if
can
I
I
can. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
like, how would we not be on like a date with destiny if the debt isn't like at what point does the U.S. debt get so high that confidence in the U.S. just like go and
Well,
then
the,
Right.
the the total truth is we don't actually know, and I'll tell you why. Japan is at over 220% of GDP now for debt. We have another 100 and something percent to go before we get to Japan, and nobody's lost confidence in Japanese debt. So the governments, I mean, John is right. Governments don't run the way households do.
hmm
So that portion of it is not necessarily a disaster. It could be, but it also could not be. We don't know. But the thing that is worrisome here, which is what I want to amplify something John just said, the thing that is worrisome here is what's happening now with the administration, because a loss of confidence in the US government would in fact be a problem, even at 100% of GDP as opposed to 220%. And that's the issue. It's the confidence in the United States government that allows the United States government to borrow these giant sums of money and nobody cares. If you lose confidence in the government, that's no longer true.
can you
And the
define
more confidence you lose, the higher interest rate goes.
can you define confidence? Because I think plenty of people would say that they've had no confidence in the U.S. government for a very long time.
Confidence simply means whether or not the United States is going to honor its commitments in the financial markets. So let me give you an absolutely absurd example that I read today, which came from, I think, Miran, if I remember correctly, who's the economic advisor. I could be wrong, but it's somebody from the administration. I think it's Miran. He said that because there's something is wrong, in his opinion, with the fact that the US has this big, capital account surplus, we should start taxing the interest payments that foreigners get for the treasury debt that they own. This is just, it's absolutely crazy. If you want people to lose confidence in your government, that's how you do it. Because now all of a sudden, we've had a deal with everybody for the rest of the world for 200 years. Our debt is as good as gold, right? Now all of a sudden, oh, no. We only pay interest when we feel like it. We're only going to pay as much as we want. And oh, by the way, we might decide to tax it too, all retroactively. And oh, by the way, there's nothing you can do about it. That is what causes confidence to be destroyed. And by the way, it takes, centuries to build up confidence. It takes, basically, evidently 15 minutes in the rose garden to destroy it. And that really is the issue. Confidence means that people expect you to stick to whatever your word is as the government.
Okay, fair
That's
enough.
I think
confidence.
to add to that, I think confidence in financial markets is a little bit like how the Supreme Court defined pornography. You can't explain it, but you can feel it.
Yes.
It does, and I don't have like a good, qualitative definition, but you know it when it's there, and you know when it's not, and definitely emphasis on the latter. Mm.
Eric, have you heard about this book called Why Nations Fail by a guy called Darren Acemoglu, who just won a Nobel Prize?
I have heard of the book. I have not read it though.
It's a great book, by the way. It's one of the best I've ever read. One of the things that he talks about is the issue of inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. Extractive institutions are set up just for the benefit of elites. Inclusive institutions are set up for everybody to be, benefited from those institutions. It's exactly the same idea, really, when it comes to confidence. The question is whether or not whether you're living in a high trust society or a low trust society. So one of the reasons that countries remain poor is that they're low trust societies. Nobody trusts anybody else to ever keep their word, stick to any contract, adjudicate any disputes, any of those things. And the problem with what the administration is doing is it's trying to take us from being a relatively high trust society. The United States is a pretty high trust society, generally speaking, to becoming a low trust society. And that's again bad, and that's again bad for confidence.
I want to touch on, well, you mentioned institutions, but just from the example of COVID in terms of global supply chains and things of that nature, and depending on other countries for various things like medicines or different equipment here and there. At, I think there's been and I've mentioned this on the show before, a loss of trust in the institutions that kind of like whether it's the news or certain aspects of the government or some aspects of the medical kind of field, whether it's CDC, doctory people, whatever, or health insurance. I think a lot of people have had the curtain peeled back on health insurance. Um, in terms of like being self-sufficient for the medical stuff or using COVID as a lessons learned, both for national security from the standpoint of like, okay, we can't depend on another country for these important things in terms of the administration's policy, but then also from the standpoint of like I feel like the country is going through a lot of turmoil generally. Like it feels like a very big restructuring of both society and economies and um, media and like there's like lots of things popping up and so it feels very difficult to navigate just for like for me and I pay attention, but for people like not that don't have the time or aren't psycho like me to pay attention, like where do you if you could maybe steel man the situation for in terms of optimism, right? Because we've seen as we've talked and I've agreed with both of you, it's like some of this doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, you're only going to do tariffs but without cutting taxes. Okay, that doesn't make any sense, and you're only going to do this without doing that. For is there a takeaway for people from I guess from the policy perspective with like the supply chain piece from COVID, but also just economically, is there like a steel man
Well,
that you could make for either
yes,
one? Okay,
I
go
can
ahead.
make you I can make you a steel man, and I'm going to give it to John to make his steel man.
Okay.
First, the United States and the UK as well, but the United States in particular, is extremely good in general at welcoming people from all over the world. It's still true that despite all the craziness that's occurring, people still would like to come to the United States. Because as a country, as a nation, this is one of the few places on earth where if somebody says welcome stranger, they actually mean it. That's one really good, important thing. The second is we still have, again, despite the craziness that's occurring, the world's best university system. The third is we still have the world's best tech industry by a mile. And the fourth and most important thing, which is I would emphasize to the China admirers, is that we have the ability to say, throw the bums out, right? So if somebody does something that you don't like, you have to basically live with it until that person is no longer in power. And that's an ability that we do have because we are a democratic system. And so errors can actually be corrected eventually after some significant quantity of damage. On the other hand, if you have something like China, where, well, Mr. Xi is in power and there's literally nothing you can do about it, then there's, well, guess what? Literally nothing that you can do about it. So, if you're asking me what will happen over the next 100 years, I don't know. I mean, as long as we don't shoot ourselves in the head, I think we'll do pretty well.
Fair enough. John, what about a Steelman on more the policy perspective? And then, or also, well, I guess Samir gave the more philosophical kind of points, but on the policy perspective, if you had to Steelman like best case scenario, and also I think we've covered worst case scenario a little bit, but
We might not have, by the way.
no, well then we could.
Yes, we might not
yeah,
have. I didn't want to get
yeah,
into that. We
Oh,
might
yeah,
not have.
okay, well
yeah.
let's do worst case
I'll
scenario
do.
first, so then we can
Worst
end.
case scenario
Yeah, so
first.
we
Oh,
can end. We'll
I
end on a
was looking
positive.
forward to being optimistic.
Well, we can
Uh,
do both. We'll end on a positive.
okay, I could. I'll try to do both. Listen, I think that the the underlying what makes the United States, especially in terms of economic performance, is less a you know prescriptive policy impulse and more of a underlying dynamism that exists here that doesn't seem to exist in other places to the same extent. And whether trade is a bigger part of the pie or a smaller part of the pie, I don't think is going to in 25 years mean that the US is not still the best economy in the world. It may not be, but I don't know that I doubt that that will be the principal reason. Um, so I think that, zooming out, that we're it will feel and it is very meaningful what's going on, but we're changing things on the margin. We're not kind of like, the system will still have a capitalist system that will still exchange goods and services and will still create things at a very high level. I have all the confidence in the world that will continue. And based off what we're seeing in the tech industry, I mean, it seems like that's actually growing at a faster pace than we've even seen so far. So that I think is like, you know, it's not. I don't know. We even if the marginal dollar no longer goes to the U.S. for the next 5 years, if we sort of have a reordering in terms of what global trade is, and if global capital flows are more retrenched into funding each nation's priorities instead of basically funding the U.S., which is kind of how the system has played out over the last numerous years. Those will have very meaningful consequences in terms of markets and in terms of the economy, but I don't necessarily think that that means the structure of our society now is totally different, and it may mean that we don't have a God-given right for the stock market to make a new high every year. I mean, that is possible, but I don't think that will you know undermine the United States as a great place to live and a great place to work. So that would be more positive. Listen, I think that the other positive that I do want to say, even though I've been very critical of the execution, at least we've been speaking, I think the execution has been a big problem. And I think when you're dealing with things that are so big, like global trade, like the budget, some of the foreign policy things we've been talking about, execution is imperative. I mean, listen, you know I worked at a hedge fund. I now work on the advisory side. Like, it's nice to come up with the ideas, but the guys who make the really big bucks are the guys who get the execution right. And so, what would be a shame, and it's not to say that I necessarily endorse the ideas or not. Try not to be too political. Is that even if you have a good idea, if your execution is shit, I don't know if I can curse.
Yeah, that's fine.
It doesn't matter, right? So I think that, but I think that there is a case to be made that the system of basically the United States runs all of these deficits and has appreciating financial assets, that sounds nice because it's able to fund lots of different things, not only at home but also abroad. But yeah, I do think it has had a consequence to um, the blue collar side of the economy because a large way that manufacturing has an offset is through the currency because that's how their goods are priced. And I think that we there is a very reasonable case to be made that, we've prioritized the financial side of the economy over the quote unquote real economy. And that has had, spillovers from income inequality to, different societal factions that have, felt left behind. So none of that is to say that we're going to fix all of that with, what the administration is trying to do. But I think something that Scott Bessent does say is that Wall Street had a good run. It's Main Street's turn. And as someone, who has benefited from Wall Street, I'm not saying like, okay, then this is, I'm going to go do something else. But, I think that, I think that, there has been an overemphasis on capital versus labor, and there may be positive externalities to a, even if to a normative view that is, that we need, that we're reorienting both expectations, which really matters in terms of global business, but also having policies that will have, they may have negative consequences, a lot of which we talked about, and a lot of which are being felt in financial markets, but they may have positive consequences as well in terms of different employment opportunities for communities that have been, really hurt. That's my hope. I'm not going to pitch that as a base case, because I think that there's a lot of implementation risk, as we've seen. And I'm not also going to pitch as what's the right thing or wrong thing to do. It's outside of my purview. But, I think that that is the hope, right? That is that we're deciding as a society that the financial side is done very well, and we are now going to prioritize middle income workers and wages. And I hope it works, if for the sake of us all. But that would be my optimistic take on this.
Samir, you want to go worst case?
Or oh no, I'll give Samir worst case.
Samir, you want to go worst case?
You want me to do worst case? All right. Okay. Look, here's the problem.
I won't cut this part out.
Here's the problem. Literally everything in the world that is good at the end of the day, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but anyway, I'm going to say it, depends upon finance. Why? Because finance is what takes excess savings and invests it productively. Now, are there excesses? Yes. Have we allowed them to get too big in many cases? Yes. Have we allowed too much leverage? Yes. Have we socialized risk? Yes. All of those things, yes. I wouldn't even argue them. They're true. But that still doesn't mean that finance is not critical to making a growing economy. In the process of trying to rebalance the economy with a blunderbuss, as it were, if you destroy the confidence that people have in US financial markets, the effects of those are going to be felt on Main Street, and they're going to be felt very, very badly on Main Street. And just two examples of that are pretty obvious. What happened in the 2007-2008 financial crash, or back when Wall Street imported in 1928, 29, I can never remember the exact year, right? Both those cases, the very worst effects were felt by Main Street. And my big worry is that the way this administration is going about doing things, it's going to destroy the confidence that the country spent, 249 years building up. And it's very worrying. It's also very worrying because at the same time, part of confidence is the acceptance that there will be a rule of law, and that if a judge, for example, hands down a ruling that an administration doesn't like, it's going to abide by it anyway. That's another norm that seems to be going by the wayside. Similarly, the idea that you don't change the rules midstream. If you've made a deal, you stick to the deal. That seems to be going by the wayside. To give you an example, the Obama administration got a lot of criticism when it bailed out General Motors, because it basically bailed out General Motors in a way that ended up helping the didn't help the bondholders and helped some other group. I can't remember exactly, but it ended up being a favorite sort of, one group was favored and the other group was not. That's tiny compared to what's going on right now. So that's my worry. You want the disastrous case. The disastrous case is that people lose faith in the US government. People stop buying US treasuries and treating them as risk-free, because right now they treat it as risk-free. Our interest rates go up. We end up in a debt spiral because we can't, basically the interest rates keep going up, so you can't pay them anymore, and you end up the default or something else like that. Is that likely? No, I'm not saying that it's likely, but it is a possibility. And the more I see out of this administration, the more nervous that makes me. And it's not, to me, terribly comforting that their aims are to, quote, rebalance the economy. I don't disagree with John. I think that is their aim. But the way they're going about it is not good. And my fear is that, the 1 in 100 event or the 2 in 100 event, whatever it is, actually happens. And then you spiral down and become Argentina. Because everybody forgets, 100 years ago, that was the place to go, not the United States. People immigrated to Argentina because it is the richest place on earth. Poor Italians came to the United States. Rich Italians went to Argentina.
Food for thought, definitely.
Exactly, food for thought. That's the worst case scenario. I don't think it's likely, by the way, but it is possible. Which, by the way, I would never have said before. I mean, obviously from my accent, you can tell I wasn't born in the United States, but I've lived here 41 years now. In the 41 years I've lived here, I would never have said that. It wouldn't have even occurred to me. It occurred to me in the last 6 weeks.
Is there anything that I haven't asked that I should have asked to kind of give context, or any more sort of pertinent details that we haven't really touched on yet?
Well, you haven't asked the one question that neither of us is able to answer, is should we buy stocks here or not? I don't know.
I don't know. Should we?
Well, John's the expert.
Definitely not. I mean, listen, I would say depends on your time horizon. Listen, I think that, I think over the very intermediate term, I think we have, the distribution of outcomes to me seems to be based off of, where we are today, is that there's less bad and bad. So that doesn't, excite me about risk assets in the very immediate term. In terms of the longer term, in terms of, the time horizon that's relevant for, non hedge fund people, I think that we may be going through a period of change in terms of, what's the right valuation for US risk assets, as a lot of that valuation not only came from tremendous earnings power, in terms of earnings growth, in terms of margins, et cetera, but it also came from the US was a good place to absorb global savings. And it absorbed global savings. An example, I like to give is I charted Apple's price to earnings ratio over the last 10 years versus the US net international investment position. And the net international investment position is just money that leaves the US investing abroad versus money coming into the US versus, investing domestically. And over that time period, there's been $14 trillion more coming into the US in capital than is left over the last 10 years. Pretty big number. And if you map that versus the price to earnings ratio of Apple stock, it pretty much tracks 1-to-1. And the reason, now Apple's a tremendous company, they've grown earnings, they return money to shareholders, all obvious why it's gone there. But it's just that given the size of that number, not many companies on earth can absorb that sort of investment, right? So if you look at, Apple's earnings growth, over the last 5 years, it's tracked roughly, plus 1, plus 2 versus the nominal growth rate of the US economy. It's not, let's say, an Nvidia, which has seen a, hyperbolic growth in earnings. So a lot of the valuation that's come in the last 10 years in Apple has come basically as the rest of the world treated Apple stock as a risk-free asset. And that has increased the valuation of, I would say, a large pool of US equities by a significant amount. So if that is what's being questioned now, then I think we are going to have a more medium-term conversation on what the right valuation multiple is for U.S. risk assets. But on the flip side of that, the earnings side of the price to earnings ratio, I think that over the long term, U.S. is going to continue to be a leader in terms of economic growth. And the world's best companies are still in the United States, and they will produce lots of earnings. So I have, kind of the Warren Buffett adage, I wouldn't say, has changed in terms of I invest in America and I don't turn on the screen. I don't think that has changed per se. I think that in the near term, there's lots of cross currents and headwinds to that view. Over the longer term, I still have confidence that America will figure it out. As Samir said, we could vote out the bums.
Yeah. So I can add one thing to that.
Yeah.
So the thing I can add to that is you can ask yourself, if you're not in the financial universe like me and John, what should you do? So the first thing you should do is realize that it's pointless to compete with people that spend all of their time thinking about financial markets. So don't take people like that head on. It's an error. But there are things that you can do. And I'll give you an example, a specific example. Whatever industry you're in, particularly if it's technology focused, but even if not, there is a good chance that you know something really deeply about that industry. What you want to find is investment themes that correlate with your deep knowledge of that industry. So for example, I tell my doctor friends, look, you will know before the market knows if some company is very promising, if some procedure is very promising, some drug is very promising, or whatever it is. Because it's not that they don't have the information, it's that they can't interpret the information. You should invest in those things. I have friends, for example, that are not financial professionals, that basically saw what was happening a few years ago with NVIDIA, loaded up the bucket. Now they're multimillionaires. One is a centimillionaire today, just on having bought some NVIDIA. Now you could call that luck, but it wasn't luck. It was informed thought, because they saw that there was a good possibility of a trend occurring that the market had not yet priced in. That's where you, as a non-professional, have an advantage over the professional, because A, you have knowledge that's not been priced in, and B, as John alluded to earlier, you don't have to worry about the next month and the next quarter and the next year even. You can actually say, I want to load up the boat on this thing because I'm pretty sure this is actually going to do very well. Go ahead and load up the boat on it. That's really what you have an advantage doing, and that's probably what you should be doing if you choose to do something other than just invest in, for example, cheap market indexes.
Good advice. Any last nickels before, John? I know you got to run in a little bit, but any last nickels, either of you, before we get you out of here? John?
No, I think that's good. I think I'm good.
Samir?
So I guess my only comment would be, be careful what you wish for, because you might get it.
Fair enough. All right. Well, on that happy note, thank you guys for listening. Links will be in the description as always for Samir, his book. This is like the 17th time he's been on. Maybe he'll be on 27 more. It'll be good.
Good to me.
And same with John as well. And then, yeah, check those out. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.